Sonic and the Secret Rings is not held in high regard by the Sonic fandom. Released in 2007, Secret Rings started its life as a Wii port of Sonic 06. But as the gulf in capabilities between the Wii and the Xbox 360 became painfully apparent, Sega thought that it would be prudent not to bother with the Wii port. Instead, Sega decided to set the Wii 06 team onto developing a whole new game from the ground up. No guesses as for why Sonic 06 ended up the way it did. Regardless, Secret Rings was the first Sonic game on the Wii, beating the Sonic Unleashed Wii version by roughly a year and a half. Being a Wii game, the team behind Secret Rings decided that motion controls would be a no doubt terribly fun and interesting control scheme to build a Sonic game around. And it's these motion controls that gives the game its rather infamous reputation that persists to this day. My playthrough for this review was actually the first time I've ever played to the end, although I did somehow manage to sink over 20 hours into another save file by grinding up to level 99, but more about that later. For this review, I just played the game from start to finish with minimal grinding, playing every mission as and when they became available to me. I did toy with the idea of going for 100% completion, but as this review will hopefully make clear, no. Okay, I'll level with you for a second. I'm not a story person, so definitely don't expect a super deep dive into this aspect of the game. In my opinion, the story is alright. It's just alright. The Erazor Djinn is a genie of the lamp, slowly destroying the world of the Arabian Nights page by page, as revenge for his poor treatment in the very stories he was written into. Somewhat against having her world being destroyed, a lesser genie of the ring called Shara is able to get into the real world and enlist the help of Sonic. According to the stories of the Arabian Nights, Sonic is the legendary blue hedgehog, and, always up for an adventure, Sonic agrees to help, and is taken into the book where the events of the game unfold. Long story short, Sonic gets a time bomb stuck in his chest by the Erazor, who tasks him with collecting the 7 world rings before time runs out. From there, the story follows Sonic and Shara as they travel the world of the Arabian Nights, collecting the world rings and meeting characters from the book along the way, who are represented by Sonic characters for some reason. It's never really explained, it just kind of is. The ticking clock element doesn't serve any gameplay function, it's purely a MacGuffin to incentivize Sonic to collect the world rings. The presentation is that of a pictographic, almost comic book-esque style with still hand-drawn images moving around. I think it's a nice change, since this was when Sonic games were going through a serious motion capture phase, and in games like 06 and Adventure 2, the in-engine animations fall right into the uncanny valley and feel expressionless and lifeless. By contrast, whilst being less ambitious and less technically demanding, Sonic & Co have much more expression and character in Secret Rings. The art style also gives the cutscenes a strong, timeless appeal that games like 06 and Adventure 2 don't have, at least not to the same degree. The actual plot is simple, effective, and easy to follow, which is a nice change from games like Sonic 06 and Shadow the Hedgehog. The problem is that certain story points are tied to specific missions, and as I'll discuss again later, the game can sometimes be very relaxed about the order it lets you play some of these missions. The effect on the story is that it's very easy to accidentally watch story development in the wrong order. For example, the green world ring is supposed to be the second world ring you acquire, and the associated cutscene shows that Sonic has already acquired at least one world ring prior. However, because of the rather laissez-faire mission structuring, I got it as my first world ring, and received the yellow world ring, which is supposed to be the first you get, as my second. So in my playthrough, Sonic was treating the second world ring he got as if it was his first, and the first world ring he got as if it was his second. Again, this is as much an issue of mission structure and progression, but the knock-on effect on the story is that it can end up lessening and convoluting an otherwise perfectly acceptable plot. For me, the main appeal of the story is the characterization of its 3 main characters, Sonic, Shara, and the Erazor Djinn. The Erazor Djinn is probably my favourite one-off Sonic villain, not that there's much competition. In the English translation, he's voiced by one Peter Cormican. In the cutscenes, he spends most of his time being a total ham lord, and the delivery of his lines makes him a lot of fun to listen to. You can tell the actor was having a lot of fun playing him. The Erazor is also an effective threat, as he curses Sonic immediately with a ticking clock as soon as he shows up in the story. He always has the upper hand and is constantly one step ahead of Sonic and Shara. Indeed, he uses them to gather the world rings he needs for his generic world domination plan. He's considerably less engaging in his boss fight, as the dialogue is fairly generically written and the performance is lacking a lot of the oomph that was present in the cutscenes.
You must be that blue rat that just got added to the story. You filthy rat! I'll shut that mouth of yours permanently.
Shara is probably the weakest of the three main characters in my opinion. There's nothing really bad about her, but that just makes it harder for me to say interesting things about her. She's voiced by Bella Hudson, and for the longest time I thought she was the same actress who voiced Blaze the Cat in Sonic 06. It was only whilst researching for this video that I found out that they were indeed voiced by different people. Regardless, Hudson's performance is fine, if a bit on the generic side. Nothing really stands out to me, either good or bad. Shara's main role is to be the Oracle of Exposition and the Summoner of Magic Carpets. The only major development is near the end of the story, when it's revealed that she and Erazor were apparently lovers in a surprisingly grounded depiction of an abusive relationship, and you don't need me to tell you who the abuser was. To the story's credit, it does hint at it well without being painfully obvious what it was building up to, but it is a bit, only a bit mind, of tonal whiplash in what is otherwise a fairly light-hearted plot. And of course that does leave us with Sonic, and I'm going to be honest with you now, Jason Griffith is and always will be my favourite Sonic, so this certainly isn't an unbiased look at the character. You can definitely tell Griffith had really found his feet as Sonic by now, as his performance is very solid around the board. A few lines here and there don't quite have the impact they should in my opinion, but that's the worst it gets, and that could easily be a direction issue as much as an actor issue. The writing also does Sonic justice. He's portrayed as something of an adventure lover, but he's also someone who does genuinely feel the whole range of emotions. He feels like an actual character, not just the 1990s incarnate, as he does in Adventures 1 and 2, or the Corn Lord, as he is in Colors and pretty much all subsequent games. I can't speak for Sonic Boom, neither game nor TV show, but as far as I'm concerned, Secret Rings through Black Knight was when Sonic's writing and voice acting was at its best. The Wii was, by far, the least powerful console of its generation, not including handhelds obviously. Subsequently, our expectations for Secret Rings graphics must be tailored accordingly. All the footage you're seeing for this review was captured using the Wii's component output and line doubled using the open source scan converter. The game runs in anamorphic 480p widescreen, which is standard for the console. While Secret Rings certainly isn't the best looking game ever made for the Wii, it nonetheless does get a lot of things right. The textures are surprisingly sharp for the Wii and mostly stand the test of time. The character and enemy models, especially that of Sonic's, have a pretty good poly count and the lighting used is decent enough. The game also makes a good use of a vibrant colour palette without being eye-blindingly saturated. Secret Rings' biggest strength visually is its art style. Good art direction beats raw horsepower every time, and the game's simple, cartoony style gives it a real timeless edge. So the end result is that Sonic and the Secret Rings' visual style hasn't aged nearly as poorly as other, more technically advanced games from the same era. With all that said, Secret Rings clearly wasn't given the time needed to unleash the Wii's true potential. The environment, despite the good textures, have a pretty disappointing polygon count even by Wii standards. Moreover, the game's locked to 30 FPS at all times, and whilst granted it is a very stable frame rate with next to no slowdown, it's nonetheless disappointing. The biggest problem with the graphics, however, is its very aggressive use of anti-aliasing. Some AA was always going to be needed, given the Wii's low 480p resolution, but Secret Rings' methods go too far the other way, and leave the image looking really mushy, to the point where faraway enemies and hazards smear into undefined blobs, and it's the same reason why so many N64 games just look so blurry when playing on original hardware. When given the choice, I will always prefer no or minimal anti-aliasing over too much, and this is something that would later be improved in Sonic Unleashed. But Secret Ring's visual issues don't end there. Chief and point, Sonic's animations generally feel very janky and lacking in polish. From a standstill to a full run, he has only 2 intermediate animations. About 80% of the time is spent in the same jogging animation that merely loops faster and faster as he gains speed, momentarily transitioning to a faster jog cycle, and then almost immediately to a full tilt, arms behind the back run. Sonic doesn't have any animations for moving side to side either, instead he just kind of slides around like butter in a warm pan. This can be easy to overlook when you're running at full speed, but it's extremely distracting when moving from a standstill. The clipping of Sonic's feet whilst running also becomes impossible to unnotice once you're aware with it. Coupled with the limited movements of his legs and feet, Sonic's run cycle generally feels very stiff and lifeless. Also, there's no animations for Sonic mounting onto a grind rail, so the game just uses an animation of him doing a 180. So the graphics and visuals are something of a mixed bag, but does the soundtrack fare any better? The big problem is that quite a few of the tracks have lyrics, quote unquote, that consist predominantly of 2 or 3 sentences that just repeat ad nauseum. Probably the most infamous example of this is the music in Evil Foundry, which uses the word place so many goddamn times that it becomes almost sickening.
3, 2, 1.
Whoa! Who's the big guy?
I've never seen a
The game also massively overuses its main theme, 7 Rings in Hand, using it for the level select, skill building, level results, and the final boss theme. And it's a shame too, since I do genuinely like 7 Rings in Hand, and if it was only used as the final boss music, then I'd be singing a different tune. Of course, I do want to acknowledge the soundtrack's strengths. The instrumental versions of the level themes are pretty strong around the board, if a little repetitive, with a good variety of instruments, tempo, tone, etc. All of them are enjoyable at least on their own merits, and I do listen to a lot of them outside the game, so like I said, they do stand up on their own feet. Most of the music does fit with the gameplay, however the music for Skeleton Dome feels quite out of place, but I'll let you be the judge for that one. Well, we can't put it off any longer, it's time to talk about the gameplay, which is so central to why Secret Rings has its infamous reputation to this day. The controls in particular are the foundation for everything in this game, so that's where I will be spending the bulk of my attention. The game is played with the Wii Remote horizontally, which means that in-game you realistically only have access to the D-pad and the 1 and 2 buttons. Because of this, the vast majority of actions in this game are either automated or motion controlled. The first thing you'll notice is that Sonic moves automatically. His default acceleration, however, is just too slow. And even when using a short hop to get a small boost, it can take Sonic a good 4 to 5 seconds just to reach top speed. And that might not sound too bad, but considering that his top speed is already fairly pedestrian, it makes Sonic feel just too sluggish. And even this wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the mostly empty level designs. Now, there are equipable skills that improve his top speed and acceleration, and these do indeed help and make him feel a lot more snappy. However, the higher tier acceleration skills honestly go too far the other way and make him just launch off at the slightest provocation. If you want Sonic to slow down or come to a stop, your best option is to brake with the 1 button. Braking itself works more or less as one would expect, however I usually found it quicker and more precise to just jump and then stomp immediately afterwards with the 1 or 2 button. The only way to make him move backwards is by backing up, and this is done by tilting the Wii Remote towards yourself. Although be warned, the camera will not be your friend. In fact, the camera in Secret Rings generally isn't great. It really loves to hug Sonic, and whilst it's absolutely usable for moving forward, the real problem is that it doesn't adjust at all for when you're backing up. So if you missed something and need to go backwards, you might as well be walking blind. Jumping is a weird one. On the surface it seems standard, with a short hop, jump and a higher jump depending on how long you hold the 2 button, but fun fact, no. Whilst tapping the 2 button for a short hop is instant, a proper jump requires charging by holding down the 2 button. The actual jump arc is perfectly usable for the level design given to you, but Sonic's auto acceleration means you cannot jump without moving forwards, so if you accidentally fell off a ledge or something and want to jump back up there, you're out of luck. If Sonic is on the move whilst charging a jump, he will slide along and slowly lose speed in the process. Sliding along does have other quirks, such as some obstacles being impassable without sliding through them, or allowing Sonic to completely cheese these wall-hugging sections. Also, with a few mid to late game skills, sliding becomes stupidly overpowered. Moving side to side is handled by tilting the Wii Remote to the left or right, which honestly feels fine for the most part. There are various skills that increase how smoothly, quote unquote, Sonic moves side to side, but in reality all it's doing is making his side to side movement faster or more sensitive. So as long as you equip speed and smoothness skills of the same tier, basic locomotion works very well. The exception is the highest tier smoothness skill, which is so horrifyingly sensitive that it is damn near unusable for any precision whatsoever. Sonic immediately just snaps to the far left or far right unless you just barely tilt the Wii Remote. Pretty much everything else is handled by some variation of shaking the Wii Remote, chief among them being the homing attack. It works pretty much as one would expect, and incidentally, Secret Rings was the first mainline Sonic game to feature the lock-on reticle, so we have to thank Secret Rings for that, if nothing else. Sonic can occasionally home into these flying pots, and a quick tip for anyone playing this game at home, the game only cares about how fast you move the Wii Remote, not the size of the stroke, so if you want to get to the top as fast as possible, hold the Wii Remote close to your chest and start vibrating like you're suffering from intense withdrawal. You'll get to the top in no time. The game makes heavy use of grind rails, and they also take a fair bit of figuring out. If you're airborne and moving downwards, Sonic will immediately snap onto a rail, and whilst normally the distance of said snapping is very reasonable, I had a couple of incidents where it felt like he latched on from way too far away. As soon as he starts grinding, Sonic will lose speed, and tapping the 2 button will make him do a 180 to get his speed back up. However, furiously mashing the 2 button as fast as possible will cause him to randomly short hop off the rail, so for maximising grinding speed you'll need to get into a good rhythm. Holding the 2 button will charge a jump as per usual, and the 1 button will brake as on foot. If he reaches a standstill, he'll completely dismount the rail altogether, so use with caution. Tilting the Wii Remote side to side will cause Sonic to jump off, and it's intended to be used when multiple rails are in parallel. To the game's credit, when it actually works as intended, it feels awesome. Also, the game never tells you about these invisible rails, and only indicates their presence with rings or pearls floating in the air for seemingly no reason at all. A lot of the time you aren't even given that to work with, so many of these you'll only know when they're there when you've memorised their locations. Also, quick tangent, the game doesn't have curved rails at all, so instead it just knuckles straight segments together, and you get some very interesting results. After clearing the first act of Evil Foundry, Sonic gains access to Speed Break and Time Break. Speed Break is activated by pressing up on the D-pad, and Sonic will blast off at top speed and become immune to certain types of damage, almost always some limited environmental hazards. Time Break is activated by pressing down on the D-pad and will slow everything down, including Sonic himself. It's also worth mentioning that some collectibles and springs are only accessible whilst Time Break is active. You can't just use these willy-nilly, however, you need to charge up the soul gauge to a set amount before these skills can be activated. Soul is primarily charged by defeating enemies and acquiring pearls, either on the main path or in these treasure chests. Whilst both breaks do have their uses, I rarely find myself using either one of them outside of a few specific circumstances. Speed Break makes side-to-side movement extremely stiff, so you pretty much have to hope you won't slam into any obstacles whilst it's active, and late game speed upgrades make Speed Break almost completely obsolete, since you have most of the speed of Speed Break without nearly as many downsides. Time Break slows everything including Sonic down, which implies to me that it's meant to be used as a way to give the player more reaction time to hazards. But the issue with this is that whilst Time Break is active, the input lag is horrendous, and I swear there is a solid half-second delay. Keep in mind, the rest of the game felt responsive enough to me, it's just Time Break that's causing the issue. I'm just going to come out and say it, I think the controls work reasonably well in the main acts. Just going to let that sink in for a second. We will revisit this again when we get to level design, but I honestly think that the controls are at the very least playable in the main stages. And as long as you're doing what the game expects you to be doing, they do genuinely work. Now, would Secret Rings be better off with Nunchuck, Classic Controller and/or GameCube controller support? Yes, absolutely. But the controls as they're given are absolutely playable, as long as you can live with the armache once you've gotten over the steep learning curve. But make no mistake, that learning curve is very, very steep, and I don't blame people for thinking the controls are a steaming hot mess. So it may or may not have escaped your notice that I've been bringing up the skills system a fair bit, so let's have a chat about that. When you make it to the end of a stage, things like the amount of rings you have and the number of enemies you defeated are tallied up and rewarded with experience points. This is then multiplied by a factor based on how little damage you took throughout the level, capping out at a 2x multiplier for a perfect run. Completing missions for the first time and collecting Fire Souls, a precursor to Red Rings, also rewards you with a one-off sum of experience points, and naturally these experience points contribute to leveling up. Leveling up increases the amount of skill points you have, which are required to equip skills, as well as occasionally increasing the maximum ring count and increasing the soul gauge. A few key skills such as Speed Break and Time Break are unlocked after completing specific missions, however the majority of them are unlocked when reaching certain levels. Now, on paper this would be fine if the EXP requirements for the levels were fairly reasonable. And whilst they start reasonable, by the end of the game the requirements quickly balloon into obsessive grinding territory. Remember, I played every mission as and when they became available to me, and I even replayed quite a few of the main acts just for fun. But even with that, by the time I beat the final boss, I was still in the mid-40s. So if you want to get to level 99 and get all the best skills in the game, you'd better really love grinding, because you're going to be doing it for easily 15 to 20 hours of your time. That's definitely the biggest flaw of this leveling system, but even ignoring that issue, I personally just don't agree with the concept of a leveling system in a Sonic game. My personal preference would be to have all of Sonic's skills and moves available from the beginning. But if you must have unlockable skills and buffs, then make the unlocking of them fixed points in the story rather than locked behind levels. That way, there's no possibility of stages being designed around skills that the player doesn't yet have. On that note, now is as good a time as ever to discuss the game's mission structure. The game itself is broken into 7 made worlds, one for each world ring you see, plus the tutorial world called the Lost Prologue. Tutorial missions in Lost Prologue can be charitably described as a mixed bag. Whilst they do teach the basics on how to play the game, which is more than some Sonic games bother with, they are totally unskippable. This I wouldn't mind too much, but they are also horrendously over-explained, with 7 unskippable missions. A single comprehensive tutorial mission would have been just as informative and way more time efficient in my opinion. As for the main worlds, they all follow roughly the same formula, consisting of one main act, with the exception of Levitated Ruins, which has 2 main stages, and several smaller missions. 4 of the worlds, Sand Oasis, Evil Foundry, Pirate Storm and Night Palace, have boss fights. The main acts are the meat and potatoes of any Sonic game, and Secret Rings is no exception. The goal is to get to the end of the stage with no strings attached. The smaller missions are naturally shorter, no duh, and often test different parts of Sonic's skill set, such as making it to the goal without being defeated, beating a time limit, collecting rings, etc. The smaller missions either reuse geometry from the main acts or have Sonic running around a repeating 2-minute loop of level design until the objective is fulfilled. Whilst I certainly don't have an issue with side missions on principle, what I do take umbrage with is the fact that some of the missions are required to progress. Moreover, the game doesn't tell you which missions are and aren't required for progression, so you could potentially wind up playing all of the missions before the game relents and lets you progress. Also, the boss fight in Sand Oasis isn't required for progression until you reach the final boss, presumably so if the player is struggling they can just come back later when they've got more skills. However, the game assumes you beat the Scorpion before moving on to Dinosaur Jungle, because the Scorpion gives you the Yellow World Ring as a reward, and the cutscene in both Sand Oasis and Dinosaur Jungle treat it as if the Yellow Ring is your first. So if that's the case, then why let the player skip the boss fight in the first place? If it's because new players were finding the boss too hard at lower levels, that's a sign that you need to better balance the boss fights around low levels of play. Or, God forbid, you need to lower the EXP requirements to get all the juicy skills. But just because the progression and structure is flawed doesn't mean the missions are bad on their own terms, right? Well, truth be told, the levels are overall a pretty mixed bag. They're essentially linear obstacle courses, and most of the levels have a decent variety of stuff to do and are of a good length. One of my biggest criticisms with Colors, Generations, and especially Sonic Forces is that the levels are just way too short, and barely feel like they've started by the time you reach the goal. Meanwhile, Secret Rings main levels are long enough to the point that their main ideas do have room to breathe, usually without outstaying their welcome. The big exception is the first act of Levitated Ruin, which has 2 key flaws. Firstly, the level's main gimmick is the wind constantly blowing you backwards, which is an immense time sink if you haven't got many of the speed upgrades. Not helping is the level's habit of throwing these pillars at you and frequently only giving you just barely enough time to get out of the way. Secondly, the sections where you're giving chase to these flying gargoyle things are so restrictive and automated that it makes Sonic Forces look like 7th gen Unleashed. And given that, by this point in the game, your soul gauge is pretty small, you can have as much as 30-second stretches where the game is basically playing itself, and the level just keeps going on and on and on. All of the other main levels definitely are better than Levitated Ruin and are overall pretty solid, but all of them have their flaws here and there. Sand Oasis, being the first level, has quite a lot of empty space that can make it pretty boring on repeat playthroughs. Dinosaur Jungle has its lazy log flumes, and the Triceratops chase at the beginning can be really frustrating if you haven't memorised where all the dash pads are. Evil Foundry is probably my favourite level overall, as it's the most consistently engaging, but even it has its fair share of empty corridors. Pirate Storm has some interesting platforming, but this slope with the iron balls can be pretty annoying if you're trying not to get hit. Skeleton Dome is alright, but it's another one of those levels that just keeps going for far too long. And finally, Night Palace is another decent level, but these space sections are such unadulterated chaos that it can be very difficult to pay attention to what's going on half the time. Hey, guess who's recording more lines 10 months later? So given the seemingly negative attitude, why do I enjoy the main stages? Well, I think it's mainly down to a certain elegant simplicity in their design. The stages don't demand more from the player than what's reasonable with the controls or camera. Checkpoints are reasonably frequent without being too lenient. Several stages have fun set pieces, such as the Djinns of Evil Foundry or surfing and riding on the cannon shells in Pirate Storm. And finally, they're well contextualized. You actually know why we're in this world and what we're looking for. rather than just doing a piece of level we've already done, but with an arbitrary challenge attached. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled me. So whilst the main levels are solid, the side missions are a whole other kettle of fish. As mentioned earlier, most of them have special objectives, and they're 50-50 between reasonable challenges and the utterly asinine. To the game's credit, most of the missions in Sand Oasis are pretty enjoyable. They're relatively straightforward and they don't demand more than what's reasonable with the controls, and don't waste the player's time. However, once you get to Dinosaur Jungle and beyond, the missions are much more of a mixed bag. Some are okay, some are harmless but just keep going, a recurring theme for the level design in this game. And then there's the egg mission. You have to keep running around a roughly 2-minute loop of level design over and over until you get all the eggs into their matching nests. And if that didn't sound tedious enough, near the end of the loop it splits into 2 paths, and if you accidentally pick the wrong path, you have to run round the whole loop again. It took me nearly 8 minutes to beat this mission, ignoring however many restarts I needed. But no, if you want the world with the worst side missions, look no further than Pirate Storm, which has 2 contenders for the worst mission in the game. First up, we have the first Die Hard challenge. Despite it only lasting roughly 1.5 minutes, just beating this level took 12 minutes of near constant restart, and it was utter misery. A game with this kind of control scheme absolutely lives or dies on its level design, and this is a perfect demonstration of what happens when the levels simply aren't designed well around the controls. The tiny platforms require absolute pinpoint precision to land on, and are too small to allow for movements once you've landed, so if, like me, you want to back up a tiny bit because you just barely missed a collectible, good luck with that. The flying pot controls are simply too heavy and unyielding to allow for the degree of side-to-side accuracy required, and if those iron balls hit you, you instantly fall into the water and die. And, because this is a Die Hard challenge, death results in an instant fail and you need to restart, whereas most other missions have checkpoints. Oh, and as the final kicker, on the attempt when I actually beat the level, Sonic snapped to a grind rail from way too far away and robbed me of the last fire soul. So that's nice. Contender number 2 is the hands-off challenge, where Sonic must finish the level with 0 rings. I actually beat this level and got all 3 fire souls on my first try, but that doesn't excuse terrible design. Not only is this another one of those missions that just drags on, the fact that you need to finish the level with no rings practically forces you to tiptoe through the levels and make sure you don't accidentally run into any rings at all. This is especially true on your first playthrough, since, unless you know the level off by heart, you will never know when opportunities to lose rings will present themselves. Oh, and at the end is this massive section filled with rings and not a single enemy, so you have to do some of the most strict and unforgiving platforming in the whole game. Bear in mind, this is me just trying to beat the level normally. I can't even begin to imagine how nightmarish this mission must be when you're going for gold. On that note, now is as good a time as any other to discuss the 100% experience. To be clear, I haven't 100%ed this game and I don't plan to, so this certainly will not be a holistic assessment of the completionist experience. 100% completion requires 3 things: reaching level 99, collecting all of the fire souls in all of the levels that contain them, and getting a gold mission in every stage and mission. Collecting the fire souls is definitely the more enjoyable experience overall, since they generally strike a decent balance between the various types of fire souls. Those types being the ones that are easy to spot and challenging to collect, the ones that are challenging to spot and easy to collect, and the ones that require specific skills to acquire. The first 2 are fairly self-explanatory, and whilst I certainly don't have a problem with the third type on principle, the problem is that often the skills required are locked behind very high levels, so once again you'll need to do a lot of grinding before you can even start gunning for them. Your reward for collecting fire souls is a one-off EXP reward, as well as some unlocks in the game's party mode. Oh yeah, this game has a party mode. I didn't bother playing it, and I don't think anyone else did. Now the gold medals, on the other hand, are what really grinds my gears. Gold medals are awarded for beating the stage or mission quickly, and are entirely time-based, so defeating enemies and completing rings has no effect on your rank whatsoever. Whilst I do enjoy a time-based ranking system in something like Sonic Unleashed, I'm not a fan of them here because Unleashed's levels are designed entirely around speedrunning. Meanwhile, Secret Ring's main stages prioritizing interacting with the environments and defeating enemies, so time-based ranking essentially encourages the player to skip as much of the content as possible. Also, much of the gold ranks, especially in the early game, are impossible without mid to late game skills, so either come back later or more grinding ahoy. But my biggest issue with the gold ranks, and the reason why I simply don't care about them, is that they simply aren't fun. The main stages are somewhat harmless, if boring, but so many of the side missions were clearly not designed around being rushed, and trying to gold rank them is such a frustrating time sink that, to be blunt, I've got better things to do with my time. So what about reaching level 99? First of all, it takes a goddamn eternity. On this other save file, I somehow reached level 99 without ever finishing the story by just replaying Evil Foundry over and over. It took roughly 20 hours to get there. Granted, it might not take as long if you grinded some of the later levels, especially Skeleton Dome, that can give you something like 12,000 experience on a perfect run, but it would still easily take 12 to 15 hours. But is the reward worth it? As well as maxing out the soul gauge and ring count, level 99 also gives you most of the best skills in the game, and in fairness, they are barrels of fun to use and experiment with. Plus, cheese is always welcome in my books. But it takes so much time to get to that point that, honestly, I have difficulty recommending grinding to level 99 unless you are utterly mad, bored, or both. With the levels all taken care of, we need to talk about the final boss fights. The normal 3 boss fights are fairly humdrum affairs, just running around, attacking when it's opening, yada yada yada. No, the real talking point is the fight against Erazor Djinn. He starts out as a good challenge with attacks that are fast enough to demand your attention and require good timing to dodge and counter, but they're slow enough to where you're given a reasonable amount of time to react, and the attacks are well telegraphed. However, as you whittle down his health, his attacks become so fast and demanding such perfect reactions that I genuinely do not know how this got through player testing. That is, until you equip the cheese skills, at which point the boss becomes an utter joke and practically beats itself. If you want to do the cheese strat, equip the highest tier speed, acceleration, soul armor, ring saver and skimmer skills you have available. Equip the Aegis Slider skill, slide whenever he attacks, and bear witness to the damage you aren't taking. Unfortunately, what the cheese strat cannot account for is when he's doing his big slash. The only advice I can give for this is to stock up on rings and soul as best you can throughout the fight. You can't dodge this attack, only counter it or take a hit. The only way to counter Erazor is with Time Break, which, given its horrendous input lag, is basically a roll of the dice on whether or not you do the counter correctly or not. The final boss fight is against Alf Layla Wa Layla, which, for the purposes of this review, I'll refer to as Jeremy Irons. I'd hesitate to describe him as the worst final boss fight in the Sonic franchise, not even the worst boss in this game, but Jeremy is nonetheless a poor showing for a final boss. It's a dark-spined Sonic in space battle where you have to charge up the soul gauge to repel his big orb attack and strike when his guard is down as a result. The biggest problem with this fight are twofold. One, it is constant waggling. As well as side-to-side movement and homing attacks needing motion controls, charging up the soul gauge requires constant shaking of the Wii Remote. Couple this with the sheer amount of soul that the fight requires and my arms physically hurt every time I fight him. Number 2 is that the fight has a pretty steep learning curve that makes your first attempts really frustrating. His slash attacks provide very little reaction time, so unless you have god tier reflexes, the only way to reliably dodge his slashes is to memorize where they come from. Similarly, his black hole attacks give you next to no reaction time to get out of the way, and jumping will immediately force you to take damage, so once again, more memorization. He also has this attack where he throws these small lightning bolts at you, and they are a nightmare to avoid. Granted, speed break and time break can make them easier to dodge, but that also means more damn waggling. Rings are also pretty scarce, so at best you can take 1 or 2 hits at any given time before dying. The good news is that, once you've learned his patterns, he isn't too bad to fight, ignoring the intense arm ache, and unlike Erazor Djinn, Jeremy isn't a total pushover. I wouldn't say he's a good final boss by any means, but Time Eater he isn't, so that's something. Okay, with that done and dusted, we are finally ready to conclude. Has to be said, this might not have been the best choice for a first review, but whatever, we'll roll with it. Overall, my opinion of Sonic and the Secret Rings is thoroughly split down the middle. On the one hand, I do, for the most part, legitimately enjoy the main stages, which have a satisfactory length and level design that largely works with the main controls. I've also found some of the earlier side missions enjoyable for what they are. The controls themselves, once fully mastered, are absolutely functional, and if you ever do reach level 99, it is a lot of fun. The soundtrack is solid round the board, and the graphics are above average for Wii with good art direction, and the story is decent enough with good voice acting, especially that from Jason Griffith as Sonic. With all that said, there's an awful lot here to dislike as well. The controls, whilst absolutely functional, are undeniably inferior to a regular controller or a Wiimote plus Nunchuck controller scheme. The leveling system doesn't add much to the game, whilst making it harder for level designers to make well-balanced stages and missions. Furthermore, the EXP requirements are so high that there is simply no way to get to level 99 without easily 10 to 12 if not more hours of solid grinding. Most of the boss fights are forgettable, with the Erazor Djinn being a total frustration fest unless you utterly cheese him with no middle ground. And whilst Alf Layla Wa Layla is an okay fight once you've learned his stuff, getting to that point is a noticeable time sink, as well as the motion controlled induced arm ache being a real pisser. But the biggest problem for me is that the majority of the side missions are simply poorly designed around the limited controls. And I can totally understand why that would turn someone off from Secret Rings forever. Now that I have access to all the levels and I've mastered the controls, it's easy for me to cherry pick all the best bits and ignore the real troublemakers when replaying the levels for fun. And it's safe to say that that has coloured my opinions of Secret Rings quite a bit. Nevertheless, this playthrough has given me at least some insight into the unbiased perspective, and it's helped me understand why so many people utterly loathe this game, whereas I've always had something of a mixed to positive experience before replaying this game for this review. Despite all my bitching and complaining, I overall have had a fairly positive experience with this playthrough, which I feel is more charitable than most people's experience. There is a fair bit of legitimate fun to be had with this game once you've mastered the controls and the level design, but getting to that point requires such a frustrating time commitment that I honestly can't recommend this game to others. If you've never played Sonic and the Secret Rings before, I'd argue that you aren't missing out on much. But if you are looking for a time sink that doesn't involve an open world collectathon, then by all means give Secret Rings a go and see if you can learn the controls. Who knows? You might have some fun in the process.